Alright, hi everyone, and welcome to part 3 in my video on my thoughts on Bruce Lee. Now, where I last left off, I was talking about the fight between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris in the film The Way of the Dragon. Now, what happened in this fight scene was, in the beginning, Chuck Norris started beating Bruce Lee. And that was because Bruce Lee was using a traditional martial arts style. Then Bruce Lee started beating Chuck Norris when Bruce Lee changed his style and adapted to the situation at hand. And Bruce Lee's movements got much more fluid and seemed much more agile, as where Chuck Norris seemed far more rigid, far more stiff, kind of like a karate guy. Didn't seem as mobile as Bruce Lee did. And Bruce Lee ended up, winning the match. And, it ended with, at least in the movie anyways, the death of Chuck Norris's character. Now, after this movie was made, Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris started training together. And Chuck Norris, and I've heard this in interviews, would say that they would do these grueling 3 to 4 hour training sessions, and then they'd go back into Bruce Lee's house. Bruce Lee's wife Linda would bring Chuck Norris some iced tea, and immediately Bruce Lee would begin training again. He'd be doing sit-ups, and Chuck Norris said that he was just unrelentless, that he was training all the time. And a lot of people said that he may have even overtrained quite a bit. But that's just the way Bruce Lee was at the time. Now, another thing I want to talk about kind of around this time, maybe a little bit before this time, was Bruce Lee's appearance on the Pierre Berton show. Now, Pierre Berton was a Canadian who would interview a lot of people from different locations around the world. And he would interview people that American mainstream media would not interview. For example, he had an interview with Malcolm X, he interviewed Bruce Lee. Mainstream media wouldn't have interviews with Bruce Lee at this time. So Pierre Berton went to Hong Kong and interviewed Bruce Lee, and you could find this interview online because it is there. It's about 26 minutes long, and I do recommend it because you really do get a lot of insight into the way Bruce Lee thought at this time, how he felt about Hollywood, and how he felt Hollywood was kind of preventing him from advancing his career, and how he felt kind of frustrated about certain things but understood how other things kind of worked. And Bruce Lee also elaborates a little bit onto his philosophy here as well, where he talks about, his different beliefs, and, he talks about, just like the training that he would do. He talks a bit about, Kung Fu and all that. But, yeah, like I said, definitely an interesting video, and I definitely do recommend, checking it out. But another thing I do want to mention was, after this, Bruce Lee actually wrote and he wanted to direct and produce a film called The Silent Flute. Now, The Silent Flute was going to star, Bruce Lee as well as James Coburn. However, there's a lot of logistical problems involved in filming this movie and putting it all together, and they couldn't really find the proper location to film it, and as a result the film got pulled. It was never made and was just kind of shelved. Now, later on, after Bruce Lee's death, the story of this film was put into a movie starring David Carradine called The Circle of Iron. And that did include a lot of plot elements from The Silent Flute. Producers and directors have actually talked about, wanting to make the film The Silent Flute. Whether or not it will ever happen, I don't know. But I know there has been some talk about wanting to make this film. Now, after this, Bruce Lee then began working on a film called The Game of Death. Now, The Game of Death was not entirely finished. Bruce Lee was working on a little bit of it, and this is the film where Bruce Lee wears that yellow tracksuit that he's been famous for. And in this film, he fights different martial artists on each level of a pagoda, with the unnamed opponent at the top of the pagoda and different martial artists below. One of the martial artists was his friend Danny Insano. And it was Danny Insano that actually got Bruce Lee into using the nunchucks. And very quickly, Bruce Lee picked up on how to use the nunchucks very fast. I mean, Danny Insano said that he showed him how to use the nunchucks, and literally within weeks, it had looked like Bruce Lee had been training with the nunchucks his whole life. So he got really, efficient at that. But, yeah, and so in the movie, Bruce Lee works his way to the top, where he faces, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who's probably almost 3 feet taller than Bruce Lee. And Bruce Lee fights Kareem, and he ends up beating him, I think, with like a headlock, from what I can remember. But the movie was shelved for a while. It wasn't finished at the time because Bruce Lee then received a call from Warner Brothers, and due to the success of Bruce Lee's other films, Hollywood was now interested in doing a martial arts film starring Bruce Lee. And the film was called Enter the Dragon. That was the film they were going to do. And this was the first ever partnership between Warner Brothers and Golden Harvest Studios. So, it was a fairly big production. Cost about $850,000 to make, and it ended up grossing around $200 million. So it was a very successful film. One of the most successful films of 1973 was Enter the Dragon. So, there's some other stars in Enter the Dragon besides Bruce Lee. You also have John Saxon in it, and John Saxon has said in interviews that Bruce Lee really, trained hard and always seemed to be training for a fight that never seemed to come. He definitely said that about Bruce Lee. But in addition to John Saxon being in this film, you also had Jim Kelly in the film as well. Jim Kelly had won some, karate tournaments. I know he won some big karate tournaments that were in California. He was actually a tennis instructor by trade, but he did do some movies as well. Enter the Dragon. Later he would do Black Belt Jones as well. But yeah, so he did Enter the Dragon, and Enter the Dragon to me always seemed kind of like a martial arts version of a Bond film. It really did. It definitely seems like that kind of movie. You also had Bolo Young in the film, and Bolo Young, like I said in the video I did on Bloodsport, always played kind of like a bad guy in a lot of movies, and that was because it was always to kind of showcase that if you're a really skilled martial artist, you could beat a bigger, much stronger opponent. So Bolo Young was usually that bigger, stronger opponent, and that was the character he played in Enter the Dragon. So, Bruce Lee then finished Enter the Dragon, and around May, he started having these, really severe headaches. And this would have been May of 1973. And he had to be hospitalized as a result. He then got out of the hospital, and he then resumed working on the film he was working on before, and that was Game of Death. Now, Bruce Lee then attended a meeting, or what was going to be a meeting at an actress's house, where they were going to be meeting with Raymond Chow to discuss, Game of Death and putting, Game of Death together and all that. And Bruce Lee started getting, bad headaches again, and the actress gave Bruce Lee some aspirin. He took the aspirin, went to lay down, and then the actress, couldn't wake Bruce Lee up. Raymond Chow got there, and he couldn't wake Bruce Lee up, so they called an ambulance. They took Bruce Lee to the hospital, and Bruce Lee was pronounced dead. Now, one of the things that they did find in Bruce Lee's system was cannabis. Apparently, from what I'm told, I think he did do some of that. I don't think he was a drinker or a smoker, but I do know that I think he did occasionally do cannabis. But, yeah, so, Bruce Lee had died, and the official cause of death was an allergic reaction to aspirin. Now, there have been a lot of conspiracies surrounding Bruce Lee's death. I mean, a lot. I mean, I've heard everything from Wong Jack Man killed Bruce Lee. But, that would have been impossible, because after their fight, Bruce Lee went on to make, movies. So, how could that have happened, But I've heard other things where people have said that Chinese triads killed Bruce Lee. I've heard people say that he was killed by a martial artist's dim-mak death touch. I've heard all kinds of, just different theories. There was one theory that claims that Bruce Lee was a part of the Illuminati, and that the Illuminati killed Bruce Lee. Now, the interesting thing about this is that his mom was actually related to, or a part of, the richest family in all of Hong Kong, one of the most wealthy families in all of Hong Kong. I believe I don't know if it was her father or grandfather, was actually a Jewish Dutch knight from England who had been knighted and lived in China, and, spoke Chinese, dressed, in Chinese clothing. But I guess he was originally from England, and he was of Jewish, Dutch descent. And, there's some belief that he may have been a part of the Illuminati, and therefore that, Bruce Lee's family was a part of it, and that the Illuminati killed Bruce Lee. So who knows? That's just one of the more recent conspiracies that I've heard surrounding Bruce Lee's death. So there are really quite a few. But immediately after Bruce Lee's death, it launched an era known as the Bruce Lee era. Now, this would have been around 1973. Immediately, Bruce Lee became really popular. His movies were very popular. In Hong Kong, you started getting all these Bruce Lee clone actors. There's even an actor named Bruce Lee, Lee spelled L-I. The real Bruce Lee spelled his last name L-E-E. But, so in Hong Kong, they kind of tried to deceive people with these Bruce Lee clones. They tried to, trick people into thinking Bruce Lee was still alive. So that's why some people believe Bruce Lee made more movies than he really did, because there were all these, Bruce Lee clones coming out, putting out movies. And, this was before the internet, so, you could kind of, people would deceive people in this way in the years before the internet. So some people thought he was still alive, but, these were just, Bruce Lee clones, because like I said, his death created a void. And, that's what happened in Hong Kong. In the United States, the person that filled the void created by Bruce Lee was Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris started getting more movie roles and, becoming a famous martial arts actor. In fact, Chuck Norris does have some good movies, like Good Guys Wear Black. It's particularly a good movie. Some other good ones like Silent Rage, Octagon was another one, A Force of One. I think maybe in the future I might do a video on some of the better Chuck Norris movies. Now I know there's a lot of like Chuck Norris jokes out there, which I think originate from the Conan O'Brien show. That's where I think those originate. But yeah, so Chuck Norris, like I said, became a big star, filled that void that Bruce Lee had left behind. And like I said, Bruce Lee's popularity still grew. It just kept growing, and he was really on the brink of superstardom before he died. Unfortunately, he never got to see that because Bruce Lee died July 20th, 1973. Enter the Dragon came out July 26th of 1973. So he died just 6 days before Enter the Dragon came out. So he never had a chance to see his success. But he really did become successful. That's definitely for sure. But, yeah, so, like I said, Bruce Lee died. There were a lot of Bruce Lee clones. And another thing that I did want to talk about is there's a whole genre of film called the Bruceploitation film. And yeah, that is another thing I wanted to mention, because literally I think there were like hundreds of these Bruceploitation films, I've been told. And, some of them a little bit accurate. I know there was a biopic I saw on Bruce Lee done by, the Bruce Lee spelled L-I. It was maybe about 50% right. At the end of the film, they talk about different, like, conspiracies surrounding Bruce Lee's death. One of them was the fact that Bruce Lee may have just thrown everything away and just decided to, become a monk and traveled around China kind of as a recluse, and that he wasn't going to return to Hollywood until 10 years later in 1983. That was one of the things this biopic said. But there have been better biopics. The one Dragging the Bruce Lee Story is one I particularly like, the one starring Jason Scott Lee. I think that's a good one. But there were others. There was one I saw that was completely fictitious. And this one talked about how Bruce Lee was actually from Japan and a member of a long line of samurais. And the movie was just totally false. Bruce Lee wasn't even from Japan. He was Chinese. He was from Hong Kong. So I mean, or he lived in Hong Kong. But yeah, so the movie was entirely false. And then the second half of the movie was, who will the next Bruce Lee be? And they went to a karate tournament and found who they thought would be the next Bruce Lee, an individual by the name of Ron Van Cleef. And Ron Van Cleef, I guess, had won a lot of karate tournaments, and they kind of thought he would be the next Bruce Lee. And I guess he was beaten, I think, by Hoist Gracie right away in one of the early UFCs, in spite of the fact that he was hyped up a lot. But hey, at least he did it. At least he gave it a shot. But yeah, so just a lot of interesting things surrounding Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was actually buried in Seattle. That's his wife had him flown back to the States, and he was buried in Seattle. But yeah, so the next thing I want to talk about is kind of the impact and the legacy that Bruce Lee had.